Hi there. Happy Friday. It's good to be live with you again. Last week we pre-recorded because I was in Florida with my mom. It was a wonderful time. This week we have a special little guest with us, my great niece. I am a great auntie. And
She is.
so hopefully everything goes well here with baby in hand. But it's fun to go back to this stage. My youngest is 8 now. So to have a little baby in the house is kind of fun. Anyway, we are Nathaniel and Amy White with the Homemade Family. And for the month of August, we are going to be talking about 4 keys to great relationships. We'll cover 1 key each week. Really, we were thinking great for great marriages, but the truth is a lot of these keys and principles can be used in all relationships, especially in parenting relationships also. So our first key, this key actually saved our marriage. I am so thankful for this teaching from our old pastors. They just absolutely, this saved our marriage. This teaching is called Verbalizer Feeler, and this is the way that we process information and communicate with each other. And we're going to just go into what those words mean, help you identify which one you are, and then give you great tips for what do you do then now that you know whether you're a verbalizer feeler. So
because almost guaranteed your spouse is going to be the opposite. So here's just some ground rule type information. First of all, what we're going to give you today are traits of verbalizers and traits of feelers. Another term we'll use for feelers is internalizers. Those are interchangeable. We mean the same thing by them. So verbalizers, internalizers, same thing. But you are going to identify with some of the feeler traits and you're going to identify with some of the verbalizer traits. But what you want to pay attention to most when you're trying to be like, oh, I'm a verbalizer or I'm a feeler, is which one do you identify the majority with or the strongest with? Now, what we have found is that you are almost guaranteed to marry someone who is not what you are. So if you're a verbalizer, you are almost guaranteed to marry a feeler. And if you are a feeler, you are almost guaranteed to marry a verbalizer. So these are going to be tips that will save you intense amounts of pain and frustration and work. Like, we are about to save you a ton of frustration and pain. So get ready.
Yeah. When Nathaniel and I first got married, as most newly marrieds do, we ran into some bumps and some conflicts along the way.
Especially because we never dated and we were only engaged for 6 weeks.
Yes, which is another story for another time. We'll have to share that one. But Nathaniel would be like, hey, we need to talk about this, blah, blah, blah. And he'd get going. And I would just be like overwhelmed and I would shut down completely. I would not talk. I would not listen. I would just go do my own thing. And not only is it conflict avoider, but it was because I was a feeler and we didn't know these things. But he thought...
I thought she was broken. I'm like, broken. What childhood trauma did you have that you are incapable of enduring any level of conflict?
Yeah, or conversation or whatever. Like, I would just be like, deer in the headlights, shut down and completely shut him out. And it was leading to... it was getting just worse and worse because Nathaniel was like, we need to take care of this. We need to talk about this. And I was like, you're driving me crazy with all your talking and all your words and always going on and on about this. And so I would shut down completely. Yeah. And we kind of were to the breaking point where I'm like, I just can't deal with this guy. And he was like, I can't deal with her. She's got problems, man. And then we had this teaching and we were like, and we began to put it into play. And now we've been married for 15 years. We have a great marriage. We communicate wonderfully. Communication really is the heart of every relationship. And there are so many good tools out there for communications and teachings, but this one is just one that we found is really, really important. You can use it in all your relationships, like we said. And, there's this basic assumption that when you come to a relationship that, when you speak words, they mean the same thing to you that they mean to other people. But what you find is if there's different meaning, then people are interpreting them different, then you're not on the same wavelength. So we're going to jump in with what are the traits of a feeler? What are the traits of a verbalizer? And that will help you to determine which one you are and which one your spouse is. And you're also going to notice these traits in your kids and maybe people around work
Some friends
as well.
that you're close enough with. Yeah.
Yep. Okay.
So the first trait we're going to talk about is what words mean to them. What do words mean to a verbalizer? What do words mean to a feeler? And as we go through, we'll probably just kind of let the feeler talk for herself and the verbalizer talk for himself. And that, sometimes we might, help each other out in just drawing out more detail or things like that. But, and also we'll try to give you tips as we go along for how do you use this information in your relationship. So trait number one, what words mean to verbalizers, what words mean to feelers. To a verbalizer, words are very important. Very important. And not just words like, oh yeah, they like reading books or they like words. I mean, they use exactly the word they mean to use. And I don't know how many times we've been having conversations, especially in intense situations and intense conversations or in conflicts. I will very intentionally think through exactly what I mean to say, and I will say exactly that sentence. And I'll say to Amy, look up every one of those words in the dictionary. That is what I mean. And that is the limit of what I mean. And I mean nothing less than than those words. Like, hear that.
Yeah. So for verbalizers, words have a very specific meaning, but for feelers, Nathaniel's the verbalizer, I am the feeler. I use words in a way that I'm trying to express an idea or a thought or a feeling. And so I want my words to paint a picture of the general concept. I want to portray a feeling. And so feelers will often use words like always and never. For me, if I say put your shoes on, I mean put something on your feet. I might not really care if they're sandals or tennis shoes or boots or whatever. I mean put something on your feet. But to a verbalizer, they're like, do I put my sandals on? Or if I say, put your sandals on and then you put your shoes on, then I'm mad because I actually want you to wear your sandals. Like if I say sandals, then I probably really specifically mean sandals, but otherwise I just say shoes and I can mean sandals or I can mean boots, but it doesn't have to be the exact word.
And sometimes this is where we see this play out currently in our home most often is like, it'll be in the things that Amy says in moments where she's frustrated about something. Like she'll walk in a room and all the rest of us are sitting in a room or we're doing whatever in the room and we're fine. But she'll walk in and she'll be like, oh my gosh, this room is disgusting. Or it's so chaotic in here. This is a horrible mess. How can you possibly be okay being in this room the way that it is?
I can't live here anymore.
I can't live here anymore. We actually went through a period one time where, I don't know, Amy had a whole variety of injuries and stuff that was coming up frequently for a period of time. And it was at least once a month that she said something, literally that she said, I think I'm going to die. And at some point I said to her, honey, I need you to stop saying that you think you're going to die because those words have completely lost all meaning to me. When you are saying them, it's like the boy who cried wolf. And if you were ever actually in a real emergency, I don't have confidence that I would be able to recognize it because I need those words to actually mean something.
Yeah. So tips for dealing with this situation, especially in conflict. So feelers, when your spouse or your other significant other or your kids are using specific language, then listen to the words they're saying, because oftentimes what happens is Nathaniel will use a specific word and I take it to an extreme that it's something much worse than he says. And he's like, that's not what I said. This is what I said. Or for then the verbalizers, when your feeler is saying always or never, don't take it personal, because usually you're like, wait a minute, always? Like I I don't actually do that very often, like twice in my life or something. So try not to take it as intensely as that.
Yeah.
It just gives you help with not overreacting to certain words.
And it's okay to just, hey, this is what I heard you say. Is that really what you meant? What did you really mean by that? We'll probably come to a story about a moment of that in our marriage that is really funny now, but was very scary in the moment.
Mm-hmm.
We'll get to that story later, I think.
Okay. So another trait for feelers is that under pressure, what does a feeler do? Under pressure, a feeler will shut down. And the reason that they shut down is because there's too much input coming at them. They don't know how to react to it because they haven't had time to think about it. And so instead of like reacting or overreacting or having feedback, they just completely shut down. Like, I don't know. And this is what was happening with us in the beginning. Nathaniel was coming at me with all these words and all these things, and I just couldn't process that fast. And so I would shut down.
Right. Whereas verbalizers tend to increase the pressure. Under pressure, verbalizers increase the pressure. And so in those moments of conflict in those early days, when I would say something and get no response from Amy, to me, what my wiring tells me to do is I need to communicate more. She must not have understood me. So I need to say it again. I need to say it better. I need to figure out a different way to say it. And it wasn't that she didn't understand me. It's just that she hadn't had time to process it, to come to a conclusion or a decision on what she thought about it. And I had no understanding of that as something that somebody might need. So then she's shutting down, I'm intensifying, and I'm just compounding the problem. Her shutting down more is compounding the problem. And that's why we kept cycling through these things and the conflict after conflict in those early days of marriage.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. And this is helpful to remember. And some of the tips for dealing with this is that when you are in conflict with a verbalizer or a feeler, especially the feeler needs to say something like, I'm feeling full. Could I think about this for a moment? And then I will give you an answer, or I need a half hour. I will come back in a half hour. We set a very specific time limit for how long to think about and deal with this to come back to it. Verbalizer, what feedback do you have in that?
For a verbalizer, it's very hard to just put a cork in it. Verbalizers tend to feel an intense amount of drive and pressure, to an urgency. Like, we have to fix this. We have to talk about this. We have to address it. And it's very urgent, very intense. It's like, you want to stop talking through these things? Like, what are you trying to suggest? Like, I've got a volcano erupting and you want me to try to put a cork in this. So it can actually be very, very difficult for a verbalizer to just stop. To help with that, if the feeler can say, hey, I'm full, I need time to process this. Please give me an hour and let's come back and let's finish this then. Mm-hmm. Having that ability to know, okay, I'm going to get a chance to finish this, and this is when that's going to be, helps a verbalizer walk away from a conflict. In our early days, it was just, I'm shutting down, I'm done, I'm going to bed. And I'm like, no, like, you have to stay here. When there wasn't a hope or a confidence that this was going to get resolved, and on an occasion when maybe Amy actually did just walk away from it and she went to bed, and the next day she's feeling fine, because that's what happens with an internalizer, is they get away from the moment and stuff gets sorted enough or buried enough on the insides, they stop feeling the intensity of it, and they think everything's okay. Well, then she'd come and I'm still like, man, I just had a horrible night's sleep. I couldn't sleep. I was still feeling this whole issue all night long, and I'm still feeling it now. When can we talk about this?
This is really great insight into our kids also. So if you are a verbalizer parent and you have an internalizer or feeler child, and especially in moments of correction or in moments of high stress, if the verbalizer parent is coming on too strong, it will shut the child down, or you're asking for a response from this child and they're not able to give you one. And you think they're being defiant, but really they just haven't had the time to process, to understand what they feel about that, or what they were doing, or, so giving them that moment to slow down and breathe and think about something before they come at it. And especially sibling relationships too. We see this where we have a high D, but also a verbalizer coming at, a really internalizer other sibling, and having them have grace for each other. Like, hey, no, you actually need to talk and you just need to slow down and back off for a minute, because I can see that child is completely shutting down and this is going nowhere. Right. And so when we understand the way that we're wired and how we need to process that, then it can give us tools to have better, healthier relationships. Right. So the third indicator is the speed of talking. As feeler, I don't necessarily know that a feeler talks slowly, but a feeler will often not have a lot of language for something. Like Nathaniel's always asking me immediately after sermon, how was that? And I'd say good. And he's like, what does good mean? And I'm like, I don't know. I need to think about it for a minute. I don't have the words right away. Or that's why we have to have talk notes and we have to go through them before we get on air, because I can't just talk. I actually have to think about and have a plan for how I feel about that. What do I want to say about that? What is the depth of that? And also another great indicator of this is that a feeler very often will have a conversation, a brief something, and then they go away and they think about it and they're like, oh my gosh, I should have said this and I should have said that. And I should have said, I know all this stuff. Why didn't I say it? Well, because I didn't have the time to think about it, to respond appropriately in the moment.
Yeah. Whereas a verbalizer, because they think out loud, I don't know if we said that already, but just in case we didn't, I don't think we did. A verbalizer thinks out loud. They often don't even know what they think until they hear it come out of their mouth. And oftentimes it's not the first thing that comes out of their mouth. You got to stick with them for a while as they talk through and refine and refine and refine, because words are important to them. And they've got to find exactly what they mean. They're not content with a general statement. They've got to find the exact phrase of, this is what I'm talking about. This is what I'm feeling right now. This is what's going on. This is what the issue is, whatever it is. What I just did is a great example, actually, because I was trying to find exactly the right way to say it. And I found 4 different ways that said something kind of like what I'm actually trying to get at. So she'd have never said it that way, but because I'm the verbalizer, that's what came out. So, because verbalizers think out loud, they can be prone to making rash commitments. Like, sure, we can do that. And then later on, they think it through and they realize, oh, actually, I'm overbooked and this wasn't a good idea and I can't do that. So verbalizers may end up needing to take back commitments more often than feelers do, or taking back statements that, after they give better thought to it, then maybe they need to say something more accurate to what they really meant. But with what Amy was saying about talk notes, I'm always like, hey, let's get together 10 minutes beforehand, talk over a general topic. What are we talking about today? Verbalizer, feeler? Okay, well, we can just chat on that for half an hour. That's easy. And for those of you who listened to us when we used to go on with our friend Chris Bassett, that's all we would do. We'd get on an hour ahead of time. We'd have an hour of conversation, and then we would just let that conversation flow into the half-hour program of the podcast. And Chris and I would leave every single week oh my gosh, that was amazing. Revelation was flowing and so many amazing things were said. And Amy was like, what just happened? Like,
Yeah.
I don't even know if there was anything valuable in that whatsoever.
Yeah. You'll notice that a verbalizer can talk about anything without, like, at a moment's notice, drop of a hat. They can just talk, and they will talk and talk. And you'll notice the internal processors, because they're the quiet ones. Because one, we don't want to interrupt. And two, we're thinking about it. And by the time that the verbalizers have gotten 3 subjects down, we finally have something to say about what we were talking about 3 subjects ago, but now the conversation has moved on. And so a really great way to deal with this, especially for feelers, when you know if you're a verbalizer or you're a feeler, there's some tips for things like, so as a feeler, I know that I have to think about things before I really have an opinion. So in mom world, my kids come to me and they're like, Mom, can I do this? Mom, can I buy that? Mom, can I, and a lot of us are just this knee jerk, no, or yes, go ahead and do that. What I've learned to say is, you know what, let me think about that for a minute. And then I'll get right back to you. And then I think and I process through, and then I get right back to them. Can I go play with my friends right now? And I'll say, you know what, not right this second. Let me think about that and see if there's anything we need to do first. Give myself a moment to process that before we just send them on their way.
Yeah. Another thing to be aware of with that dynamic, a tip of how to handle this is just verbalizers. If you get 2 or more verbalizers in a conversation with each other, good luck getting a word in edgewise. They're probably going to be interrupting each other. They may even be talking over each other at the same time, and be okay with that. Oftentimes they'll be okay with that. And if you come to them in the middle of it and say, hey, do you actually hear each other? Do you understand what's going on and being said? They'll be like, yeah, well, they said this, and they'll give you the history of the 5 different subjects they've covered in the last 3 minutes in this conversation, this rapid fire conversation. If you interrupt a feeler, however, you may not get the rest of the sentence, because all of a sudden you are providing new input that they then need silence to process, and you might not actually you might not get them to finish what they were saying. Because I know my tendency to talk and talk and talk and talk and talk, I've had to make intentional choices like, hey, at the end of the day, when we're brushing our teeth, instead of saying, hey, here's all the things that I'm thinking about, here's how my day was, here's what I want to connect about, I'll ask her first, how was your day? Is there anything you want to talk about? What's going on in your mind right now? What are you thinking about right now? And it isn't usually until I even bring attention to it, what are you thinking about right now, that she even becomes conscious of, oh, this is what I'm thinking about right now. And we have a conversation about it. But it used to be, I just never heard what was going on inside Amy. And oftentimes she never knew what was going on inside of her. But we started learning it when every time she'd go for a walk by herself, she'd come back and be like, oh my gosh, God was talking to me about this, blah, blah, blah. And she'd be really excited about these things that God was talking to her about. And we realized all she needed was some quiet space.
Yeah, to actually think or hear from the Lord. Yep.
Yeah.
All right. On dealing with issues, this is another indicator on dealing with issues. A feeler will tend to be the one who blows up because we've stuffed it for a long time. A feeler or an internal processor actually thinks that they've dealt with something because they've kind of thought about it, compartmentalized it, stuck it in another room somewhere inside their mind or their heart, and they're good to go. They'll go to sleep, wake up, and they're happy and they can move on. So a feeler tends to stuff things, and then all of a sudden they blow up and explode. That always and never start coming out. And
or other intense statements.
Other intense statements. Yep. So issues can actually be really hidden. And we've noticed this in many marriages. Maybe you've even seen a marriage or two end like this, where the verbalizer honestly had no idea that anything was wrong. And then all of a sudden there was this huge blow up. The internalizer or the feeler just is like, I'm done. I've had enough. I'm walking away. And the marriage ends because they've just been stuffing and stuffing and stuffing and stuffing till they couldn't stuff anymore. It blows up. And then they just walk away. And the other person is like, I had no idea there was even an issue. Like,
Yeah.
what do you mean? I thought everything was fine, because the feeler never actually talked about it. They just kept putting it down inside.
And I wonder sometimes if the feeler even knew that things were as broken as they really were either, because again, they put it somewhere, they sleep on it, and they're not aware that the issue wasn't resolved. Like, oh, I'm not angry anymore. Everything must be okay. It must have not really been that big of a deal.
Mm-hmm.
And so they'll move on. But what it is it's like an infected wound. You know, yeah, it covered over and the skin is healed, but underneath it's still flaring red. And something comes along the next time there's an injury in that same space, another conflict over that same issue, and it touches that emotional area that's still infected, the hurt from it can be exponentially worse. And over time, it does become exponentially worse until finally they're just like, I'm done. That's where, this is just to kind of recap, like a feeler in the moment, they tend to shut down because they need to process. But the next time they might be blowing up because they didn't process, because they didn't actually come to resolution. And so I want to say this as a clear point of communication, that a conflict is not resolved because you stopped feeling angry. That just means you stopped feeling angry. You know, you can have a conflict and not feel angry. It just means you're not in agreement with somebody. And it's actually causing some kind of issue in being able to move forward together. So you don't have to even feel angry to have a conflict. So a conflict isn't resolved because you stopped feeling angry. A conflict is resolved because you communicated and came to a genuine agreement. That is not an agreement where the conflict avoider in your marriage caved because they're like, this sucks, I don't want to fight. That's not actual agreement. That's just acquiescence, and it's not good for the long-term health of your marriage, because eventually you're gonna feel stepped on, rolled over, walked over. Like, you're eventually probably going to resent it. There's going to be long hurt that builds up over time because you haven't actually let yourself be heard.
Yep. So dealing with issues, a feeler tends to shut down, and a verbalizer actually tends to deal with issues as they arise, because for them, they feel this, and so they need to talk and process it out. And so they tend to just take care of it right away. So when you have a verbalizer feeler and the verbalizer is like, hey, we have this issue, I want to talk about it, they start talking. First of all, don't be offended, because the place where they start might not be the place where they end up. And they might say things along the journey that they don't really mean fully until they figure out exactly what it is. And then the feeler has time then to think and respond to that. Now, super, super big key, feelers, you have to bring up issues. Yep. You can't just like sleep on it and feel better in the morning. You actually have to talk about the things that offend you, keep short accounts, short lists, actually have those conversations.
Yes. And I mean, there's so many little things you'll discover. There's sometimes where, like, I remember one time Amy and I were going through a DVD Bible study series together, and we'd watch the video, and then we'd put the kids in a stroller and go for a walk around a pond that we lived nearby. And we'd take the discussion questions with us. And we're talking through these discussion questions, and I'm probably 10 minutes into a monologue before I even realize that I haven't taken a breath. And finally I stop and I'm like, hey, Amy, I'm sorry. What do you think of what I've been saying? And all of a sudden she comes to and realizes she hasn't heard a word I said for 5 minutes, because she got stuck on something that I said and has been processing that one thing internally. And now she hasn't even heard any of the rest of it. So sometimes those things will happen, and there's not really anything that you can do about it. It's okay. Just be glad that something you said, verbalizer, meant enough or caught enough in your spouse that they were pondering on it. And that's actually a good thing. We'll just close out with one story that is also a good final tip for you guys, especially in conflict. But there was one morning in the season of life when we learned these tools. Amy was building a bookkeeping business. She was primarily the one going out to work, and I was the one staying home with the kids. And there was one morning she was getting ready to walk out the door. It's, again, in this early season of life, we're still pretty fresh off of a lot of these conflicts. And as she's getting ready to walk out the door, all of a sudden she bursts out and says, "I'm done." And I'm scared to death. Because to me, what that means is she's bringing divorce papers home at the end of her day. But in our teaching, where we learned these principles, they said, ask the feeler, what do you mean by that? And so before I freaked out, I slowed down and I asked, what do you mean by that? What does "I'm done" mean? And she didn't even know. And so we talked through it briefly, and what Amy said "I'm done" meant was that before she got home, she really needed me to have the dishes done and the high chair wiped down. That's it. That's all "I'm done" meant. So that one story all by itself shows how this saved our marriage. Because if I thought genuinely she was about to walk away from our marriage and divorce me, that's a major, major issue and destroys trust. It damages all kinds of connection, all of those kinds of things. But for me to be able to slow down, ask her what she genuinely needs, now I've got a target I can hit. And man, that was an easy one. It was easy for me to make sure the high chair was wiped down and the kitchen was clean by the time she got home. I can do that while the kids are napping. It's easy, no big deal. And all of a sudden, she feels heard. She feels loved. The pressure is released. The stress is off. We're connected again. And everything is in a good place, all because we learned some of these tools.
Yeah. All right. Next week, join us again for key number 2 to great relationships. We will see you guys then. And I hope that you were able to identify with some of these statements and figure out if you are a feeler who processes information internally.
Leave us notes in the comments.
I'm so sorry. Or a verbalizer who processes information externally. And then you can use some of these tips, like let the verbalizer talk, or feelers, make sure that you're bringing things up, and verbalizers, ask your feelers what they're thinking about. And anyway, God bless your marriages. We will see you next week. Bye-bye.
Bye.